Today I have a special guest, Gabi Zaromskyte. Hopefully I got that right. Gabby is what I would say the holy grail of a health coach, nutritionist, and a personal trainer. She's the founder of Honestly Nutrition. She's one of the nutritionists at Mahi Health. And she's also going to be telling us some interesting news around a startup that she's co-founded as well during this episode. So before we go there, Gabby, great to have you on the podcast. The first thing I want to ask you is a bit about why. Why has this become your career?
So first of all, thank you for having me here, Kiran, and thank you for such a great introduction. Why do I do what I do? It's because I really want to help women ditch the guilt and love food again, not feel any guilt around food. And it comes from initially my personal story in my teenage years where I struggled with disordered eating behaviors, and I really impacted my entire life, my work, my social circles, everything. And then when I started working as a nutritionist, I realized that it's not just young teenage girls' problems, that actually a lot of middle-aged women and also 1 in 4 males suffer with an eating disorder or some sort of disordered eating behaviors. So it made me realize that it's a massive contributor to metabolic conditions, and it really overspills into other areas of health and life as well.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
There's some things that you mentioned around your own experiences in young adulthood and childhood as well. Let's perhaps explore that if that's okay. We're going to jump straight into the deep stuff. So
sure.
What happened in your teenage or childhood years that was sort of formative for you in this?
It's actually really hard to say what one thing affected it. I think it was partly because of my character. I've always been very determined. So if I decide on something, that's what I want to do. And so I think unintentionally, I heard around at home, like my household was relatively health focused. My mom cooked healthy food, and I heard certain terms, like not too much bread, only a couple of potatoes, not too much fat. And I think as a 5 or 6 year old, I already registered these messages in my head subconsciously, because I really remember very well going to first grade to school, and there was a school cafeteria. And back then they used to allow to sell sweets in schools, so it's not the case anymore. But I remember having my pocket money and just being terrified with the idea that all my classmates are buying jellies and candy. And I was like, oh no, I can't have that because I'll get fat, as a child. So it really started earlier than I realized really what was going on. And there were kind of serious reasons for it. But I think over my teenage years, when it really exacerbated, it also grew from my determination. I was very determined to go to the gym. I was very determined to do things right and to work out. I loved the plan. I loved the routine. So that kind of rigid mindset was a huge part of it, because I think, dieting requires a lot of rigidity, right? Commitment to an intense workout routine that requires a lot of rigidity. So it kind of went line in line with my natural character traits, which then exacerbated one another. And it really came from a good intention. I wanted to do things as healthy as I could, be strong, but it backfired completely, because I found myself in this cycle of dieting and then overeating. And sooner or later, I realized that I wasn't able to get out of the cycle, that it was kind of beyond my conscious control, and that I didn't want to diet anymore. For example, I knew it was bad for me. I knew it wasn't healthy. I knew it only led to like an overeating episode, say. But then I realized that it wasn't so easy to get out of it.
You talk a little bit about progression from what happened in childhood all the way to then how that was then changing and playing out in some significant unhealthy behaviors and thought patterns later on in life. I think it's just really interesting to reflect on that actually what happens as seemingly helpful advice or like sort of non-consequential in a way when you're a baby and when you're a toddler then starts to build up into these bigger things. And of course your parents, they're trying to do the best for you, aren't they? They're trying to make sure that you are as healthy as possible. But I find that really interesting, because a lot of households, especially when children are younger, are trying to encourage them to eat more and trying to have as much as possible. But actually in your household, it was different. And was there a cultural aspect to that?
So we as kids were never limited. We were never encouraged to eat less or eat less of certain things. I just heard adults' conversations and took it as advice for myself. And what I find really interesting is that I have siblings and I was the only one affected. So it also means that I think that probably there is a genetic factor to it that they potentially don't have, a characteristic factor, like I mentioned as well. Because I find it's really interesting that my sister, for example, we've grown up together and she's never had the slightest, issue with her relationship with food. Whereas I remember when my mom gave birth to my little brother, I was around 4.5 years old. And then she was trying to lose her baby weight after her third child. And she was kind of like, I heard her comments, whether she was on the phone with a friend or looking in the mirror. And that just stuck with me. Of course, she didn't have any bad intentions, and she had no clue that a 4-year-old would remember and even register those things. So yeah, I think it's just so multifactorial.
Is this in the 90s?
Yeah.
Late 90s?
Mid to late 90s.
Mid to late 90s. So when we think about that time, we look at culture of dieting and weight loss and actually what was expected of women at the time. That's probably then fed into the subconscious of your mind because your mum was trying to achieve that. Would you say that's got any truth there
Absolutely. I think even now with the kind of clients that I see, it's two to three groups of women. So there's the youngest group of people who are in their early 20s. And then there are women in their 30s who perhaps want to start their own family, and they realize that they have learned this from their mothers and they don't want to pass it down to their children. So they're really aware and they really want to work on their relationship with food and improve it. And then, so I think this kind of generation like mine, we grew up watching Victoria's Secret models and skinny supermodels. Whereas my mom's generation, they were surrounded by Weight Watchers and counting calories and eating diet bars and drinking diet shakes for decades.
What's different about that? What's different between Weight Watchers and diet shakes compared to super skinny models? And how do you feel that changes the way that people perceive their own health?
I just think it's very similar generational differences, on the focus, of what's causing it, what's kind of encouraging it. I think my generation, or not even my generation, I think I only got social media in my late teens, but yeah, even the younger people than mine, they were influenced a lot by social media, by seeing global trends, which I think my mom's generation didn't have access to maybe as much. So they were more comparing themselves to their friends, their neighbors, their work colleagues on the more kind of local, smaller scale, but I don't think it necessarily changed the outcome.
It feels as though super skinny and thinking about models became a more extreme version of the Weight Watchers, and probably because people are getting more access to more information, and that information is more extreme in a sense because it's coming from all angles, and it just breeds more extreme information that people will consume. So I can see there's a big similarity between the two. They're both about essentially looking at what you look like rather than health focus. And I think that's really interesting because in the last 10 years, I've seen this big shift with populations. And I'm thinking from the UK about how it's less about skinny and thin, and it's more about health.
Yeah.
Although they are still closely associated for some people, the conversation is starting to change, but people's behaviors aren't changing, even though consciously they know that this isn't necessarily the way to be thinking about their health anymore or about their life and their appearance.
I agree with you. I'm really happy with the fact that the conversation is changing and at least people are aware of the fact that they should be engaging in healthy habits because of health, not because of an often temporary body that you need to keep sustaining and sustaining and sustaining. But at the same time, I feel like it can also act as an excuse. I've seen it in a couple of scenarios where people say, I'm doing it for health, but they actually just know that saying it out loud that I'm doing it just because I want to be skinny and I want to look good doesn't sound as good anymore and isn't perceived as well anymore as it used to be.
Are we still keeping up with what we think other people want to hear or what we think society will judge of us rather than actually what we really want? In a way, choosing health instead of skinny is better, but it's still not necessarily choosing what we want. It's choosing what society wants. There's a danger of that.
Yeah. I think what we want is largely shaped by what society requires of us, especially of women. I think now maybe it's changing as well because women are working, they have careers, and maybe they have different ways to prove themselves. Whereas before it was very much, like how a woman is at home and what she looks like, perhaps.
There's this, I think that with culture, if the culture is changing towards people looking towards their health rather than what they look like, I think that's a positive thing. Yeah. And I think I think the number is, I don't know where I get this number from. I'll have to find it in the study. Is 14%. So if 14% of people are doing a certain activity, then the rest will follow. So 14% of people are focusing on their health, and less people are focusing on skinny or the look, then hopefully that's going to bring the rest of the population with them. And I think that's a good thing. I do think that's a good thing. I think it's a more positive thing, but then there's still this thing around unhealthy relationships and food.
I think also what's important to mention is that as common as issues with relationship with food are, they're not that mainstream, I think, or not seen that mainstream, because only 6% of eating disorders are eating disorders of the type where a person is underweight. So most eating disorders are invisible. And so a person can be acting completely normally in front of everyone else, like, for example, having a meal with a family or friends, eating normal amounts, everything seems okay. But then something in their head is triggered, whether they feel like they ate something what they shouldn't have or ate too much. Then they come home and they just have this binging episode because they feel like they've ruined it. So I think the first step is actually for the public to be a little bit more aware that most of this problem is like an iceberg. It's not really visible.
Some people know that they have got some unhealthy eating, or their thought pattern isn't quite right, and they know that they're trying to think healthier. What would you suggest to them in terms of trying to improve their relationship with food?
The advice can actually be very different based on where people are at in their journey, because some people are ready for change. They're ready to take some risks and, unban, so to say, the foods that were banned before and starting to introduce them again. Whereas for some, this is really, really, really scary, and they're just really scared to gain weight, and they're still very much attached to the idea of weight. And I always say that you can't be obsessed with weight and want to improve your relationship with food at the same time, because they hinder each other. So you kind of need to prioritize one over the other. And I'm not saying that you will gain massive amounts of weight while on this journey, but also I can't promise any weight loss while we're healing your relationship with food, because that's not the point right now. So I always say, let's fix the relationship with food first, and then we might come back with what to weight, or actually the weight might regulate itself without us doing anything in particular about it. Whereas other people are really ready. They've read a lot. They kind of, follow social media accounts that talk about the topic. So they're really ready for change. So either way, I practice intuitive eating, which is kind of like a non-diet approach. But to start with, I actually start with a kind of mechanistic eating approach. And what I mean by that is establishing a regular eating pattern. So breakfast, lunch, dinner, perhaps a snack, no eating outside of these windows, just so you can start learning to delay kind of this food gratification and to say that, yes, food is available and you are allowed to have it. Can you just wait 1 or 2 hours until your snack time, for example? If you have a wobble or a step back, that it is essential that you start the next day as if nothing happened. So with your normal, regular eating pattern, because if not, you will skip breakfast. That will, again, kickstart the whole binging cycle, because by the time the afternoon comes, you'll want to overeat. And so I guess these are the main things. Also, mindful eating is really important. So no eating when you're watching TV, especially, people say, I have evening cravings. The whole day I'm fine, but I have evening cravings. But when we understand what's behind it, is because people have dinner in front of the television because that's their way to relax after work, or they eat when they're driving in a hurry, having coffees during meetings. So really just have dedicated meal time so your brain can register the food that you're eating.
Yeah.
This
Probably
would be
people
the first.
don't feel like they've eaten if they've not even thought about it, they're eating.
Exactly.
It's probably a big factor.
It's like kind of like that in the cinema when you're eating popcorn, before you know it, it's like the bucket's empty, but you were watching a movie and you were completely not focused on the popcorn.
Yeah.
So it's like this in everyday life.
But I wonder whether that in itself, so if people say have the movie, have the popcorn, watch the movie, and then they've eaten all this stuff, but because as if they haven't been mindful, they haven't actually thought about every single thing that they're eating, or even just generally that they're eating this popcorn, they might still feel as if they're not satisfied because the brain hasn't registered what the body's just received.
You mentioned satisfaction, and that's a really important factor, actually, because you can be even physically full, but not kind of emotionally, mentally satisfied from a food or from a meal. So when people diet, they have their small set number of safe meals that they eat again and again and again repeatedly. And they might be physically full, but they're just really not satisfied. And this also then can trigger, going back to the kitchen, opening the fridge again and again, looking for something more satisfying. And then you tell yourself, for example, you know very clearly that you want a piece of chocolate, but you can't have it. You tell yourself you can't have it. So you have an apple, then you have some granola with honey and yogurt because it's slightly sweeter than an apple. Then you go to another level of sweetness, start eating maybe honey with spoonfuls. And then before you know it, you've actually gone to the shops and bought a packet of biscuits and jellies and crisps and so on, because you just feel like you've ruined it by then. So you might as well ruin it all. And it's this like Last Supper effect.
Yeah.
The next day you feel guilty, you feel physically uncomfortable. And then you feel like, okay, well, I've eaten all these calories. This is abnormal. Now I have to make up for it. So either, what you mentioned, women being on the treadmills, like burning it off, or again, you starve yourself. And that's the fuel for this continuous binge restrict cycle.
It's as if when people enter into that binge cycle, it's a loss of control, and also with that, the loss of mindfulness. And it's like as if there's this train just passing through and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just constant. And then at some point, it got to saturation point, and then you realize what's just occurred over the last few hours, and then the next day you feel awful, and then you end up as that cycle.
Exactly. Some people describe it as a trance, where you don't register what you're doing, and then you only realize when you're out of it. But then also, this kind of behaviors can be caused by emotional triggers or traumas, and maybe, again, with good intentions in childhood, food was a sign of celebration. And so good emotion, bad emotion, there was food to cure it all. And now as an adult, a person only knows it as the only crutch for their sad, angry, upsetting, stressful situations. So what we try to do is develop more crutches in their support system, because when you have 10 crutches to lean on instead of one, food might become one crutch that you lean on once every 2 months instead of every single time something triggers you or something happens. Can also be feeling like an emotional void or numbing emotions. For example, I had this client who I worked with for a couple of years, and she managed to make great progress throughout the year, but always during winter. That was the anniversary when her mother died. And so she was trying to numb this grief that she was feeling every year, and her emotional eating went through the roof every single year. So then in these kind of cases, it's really essential to work with a psychotherapist or even a psychiatrist in some situations. It has to be a multifactorial team, build up multiple people to kind of like, where each person specializes in their own area, because I'm not a psychologist. I can help with cognitive behavior techniques and tools that are aimed for eating disorders, but I can't, I don't have the skills that psychologists have.
Yeah. And it's going down to the root cause, isn't it? Sometimes it's the food that's not the issue. And it may not even necessarily be the relationship with food that's directly the issue. It's dissociation of the food and how your relationship is because of another event that's happened that has been undealt with. And then that needs managing. And it might feel so unrelated to the food issue, but actually, unless you deal with that, the food issues are going to continue to crop up again, because that's your coping mechanism.
Yeah, and exactly. Another pattern that I notice a lot in women is, it's going to sound really cliche, but it's the lack of self-love and self-prioritization. And I notice this particularly in women who've had kids, because kids and family become priority, work becomes priority. They're not even on their list of priorities. So they would only go for their morning walk after they drop their kids to school. They would only go to the gym if the kids have done their homework and they've looked after them well and they're well fed. But then if you don't prioritize yourself, even if you want to engage in certain healthy habits, you just don't, because you don't schedule it in. And I've seen magical changes when women actually start putting themselves first wherever possible. I understand it's not possible all of the time. With your clients at Mani as well, actually.
I think what we see is when people put themselves first, and many people listening to this will have heard this before, you start to be able to show up for others better as well, and you start to give a better side to yourself. It's as if you're giving potentially a smaller amount of your time, but the quality of it is so much better than if you weren't showing up for yourself and you were just trying to be there all the time for people and trying to achieve their needs.
And I think it really builds self-confidence from within. What I mean by that is that you do the things that you told yourself you would do, and then you trust yourself. You trust yourself to get on with things. And so this builds self-confidence. But then this internal self-confidence helps you to feel better externally as well and feel better in your body. So this can help with, food-related issues and food kind of behavioral issues, because you just feel better. And it doesn't come from that side at all. It's something seemingly completely unrelated.
Well, in a way, sort of the inner control versus the outer control. So when we have inner control of self, we're not trying to control the things that are occurring outside of us. For example, trying to control the eating and the things that are being presented to us, because inwards, we've sort of kind of managed the psychological element of it. So we don't have to think about the external aspects around us. But I just think this is really interesting. You mentioned around, so the self-love we need to talk about, but we also need to talk about the mechanical eating too. Let's talk about the self-love stuff, because I think that's really, really important. I think it happens in men, but probably more so in women, around the negative aspects. So often the women that I see that are working with me that are struggling to keep good, consistent habits are the ones that are talking about control, that are talking about restriction. And then when it doesn't go well, they really berate themselves on it as well. And it's trying to change that thought mechanism. But it's actually sometimes a bit challenging for people. But I think that's a really interesting thing. Do you have any insights in how people can start to change their thought mechanisms from the negativity of, I didn't do well, I failed today, it was so difficult, and I feel so guilty, but I ate all this food and I feel awful about it? Is there any way of changing that?
Cognitive behavior therapy is great. I remember it helped me so much. And this is what encouraged me to get a diploma in CBT, which is specifically aimed at a disordered eating branch. So I think all the cognitive behavior tools are really, really effective. The thing with this whole food relationship area in general is that it's more subjective. So things can seem a bit more wishy-washy. Like when I tell clients, every time you have a bad thought, have a set of 5 positive things, ready to say to yourself. And of course, when you're feeling terrible, you're not going to want to say anything nice to yourself. So I always ask clients to have a list, 5 to 10 positive phrases about themselves, about their character, not necessarily their looks, why, they're deserving, why they're good people, and so on, and memorize them so that in bad situations, they can automatically start replacing them. In the beginning, it's really difficult. With time, it becomes automatic because the brain is learning this new behavior. And actually, before you realize, you then stop believing the bad phrase and you start believing the good phrase. So this is one of those things. But, and it's really, generally, really effective. But on the outside, it sounds so wishy-washy and really I don't know, not serious enough, I would say.
Well, I think Tara Swart, who wrote the book The Source, who's a psychiatrist turned neuroscientist turned author, she takes the science of manifestation and affirmations, and one of these things is the affirmations and how that actually influences brain psychology. So, and then there's a growing area of knowledge around what we call not mental health, but mental fitness. And this is part of that as well. So yeah, it's rooted in science, even though it feels odd to do so. So in terms of your story, you mentioned that you had this relationship when you were younger and then you started to see things differently. What was the healing processes for you that helped to get you out of the cycles that you used to experience?
I didn't have any help, which I think took me much longer than it could have. But because back then I was in a different career and I was really unhappy and I always had an interest in health and nutrition. So in my free time, I was reading studies, I was reading books, I was interested in the area. And as I was reading and educating myself about it, I just, my eyes opened up and I was like, this is not right. Something like something has to be possible. Like I have to get out of this. So then I just kind of made peace with the thought that, okay, even if I gain a couple of kilograms, I want to start introducing, say, for example, 5 new foods every week that I've been restricting. And really following, like, basically what I said, that advice, no regular eating, not skipping meals, no matter what wobble. And what really, really helped me is actually doing my health coaching course, because then I am doing more kind of, I did some university accredited courses. So that really helped me, because it helped me to understand the science behind things. And it was a big eye opener, after which I then decided to fully pursue nutrition. And yeah, I think for me, it was basically, in short, understanding of the science and of how things really work, and of how much, I'm sorry to say, BS I was fed by the media and by, I don't know, magazines, and especially women's beauty magazines in my teenage years.
Yeah.
And how that's not how the body works, and like how this dieting cycle is just kind of like, leading me to a deeper rabbit hole. Yeah, I think when I really studied nutrition, then it completely changed my mind about it.
It's sort of as if the training has been sort of a way in which you trained yourself or learned yourself through all this different trainings. And of course, there was the year spent doing it. And it's really interesting that you've done the CBT, you've done the health coaching, you've done the nutrition, and what was the other one I missed? Something
PT.
else. And the PT. So you've done all these things to really understand. And of course, you've become an expert across all of these aspects, which is really amazing. But people don't have to do all that, do they?
No, they really don't. I was just a nerd trying to understand it all myself. And yeah, it took me years, but yeah, it's really not necessary to become an expert in every field. Really, it's not.
I think that for me, I see there's 2 core aspects to this. There's the education and the learning and the depth of it. So you can have superficial knowledge, so you can know that something is healthy, but to know why and to know the depth of that is so different to just knowing something should be healthy for you. So there's knowledge, and then the second thing is around the coaching and the support. And I find that when you combine both of those, then you can start to have really big, amazing shifts and better outcomes for your health. In terms of food, there's this mechanical, I just want to just reflect on that. You mentioned that we talk about intuitive eating, and intuitive eating, I think, is the way to go. But what I've noticed in my practice is that when you don't have some of the knowledge or some of the basic foundational understandings, trying to just go to intuitive eating, it's sort of like people will respond to and say, well, what do I eat? And I know that we talk about intuitive eating, and I know people are thinking, well, what do I eat? But that's when getting some of the, not rules, but getting some of the foundational understandings of around nutrition, then you can build up to intuitive eating. Intuitive eating happens when people have all the knowledge. That's what I see.
And when they hear their body signals, that allows them to be intuitive, because how can you be intuitive when you don't feel when you're hungry, and you don't feel when you're full, or you can't stop when you're full, because you've ignored your hunger for years because you just chewed some gum or had a coffee instead. And the only fullness is when you've completely stopped feeling nauseous from a binge eating episode. You can't, people don't really recognize that comfortable fullness. So
again, that's where the mindfulness comes in, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Now, you've got some very exciting things happening, and I want to know what's happening, because we've talked all about what's happened so far and the training that you've had, but something different is about to happen, isn't it? So I'd love to know a bit more about that, and I'd love for you to tell us about that.
Yeah. So, working with clients one-on-one is just one part of my job. Despite the fact of probably being the most rewarding, it's the smallest part of my job now, because most of the work that I do is brand consultancy for other brands. So it can be like F&B product development, supplements, and so on. And I've been doing this for quite a few years now. And it just kind of naturally came about, that combination of the knowledge from brand consulting and seeing one-to-one clients. I saw a repeating pattern. Clients' concerns regarding gut health, that so many people have, especially those who have dieted, actually have so many gut issues because their gut microbiomes are depleted from that small variety, not eating a lot, any foods apart from their safe foods. So a lot of bloating, a lot of more serious chronic gastrointestinal conditions. And the solutions were, of course, lifestyle change, which I truly believe is the basis for everything. But then when it came to supplements, it was a lot of things. And I'm not someone who wants to recommend to take 10 supplements a day, because at the end of the day, it's expensive, it's inconvenient, and there has to be another way for it. Like, I wouldn't want to do that myself. So I started looking for kind of what could be one or a couple of things that would solve as many of these problems that people are experiencing with gas, bloating, IBS, IBD symptoms like inflammation within the gut. And I came across colostrum. And most people don't even know what colostrum is. And those who know mostly know it because it's the kind of first type of milk that mammals, including humans, produce a few days before and also a few days after the child is born. So this is the first thing that lines the child's, the baby's gastrointestinal system, builds the immune system. For example, skin-to-skin contact for humans, so like a vaginal birth can help to develop a microbiome and immunity initially. But also this colostrum is really the first thing that develops it internally. And I don't know why it took so long for people to actually realize that it's good for adults too, because there are studies dating back from the 90s seeing some positive hints in terms of inflammation and all sorts of like gut benefits and immunity benefits. But it's now kind of more established that it's also beneficial for adults. And the way it's done is that a bovine cow's colostrum is freeze-dried into a powder. You need very, very little of it, a few grams a day, depending on your goal as well. Can be mixed into anything like water, plant milk, yogurt bowl, anything, like kind of very convenient to consume. And why it's so special is because it heals the gut lining. So the way that the kind of initial reason why these kind of inflammatory gastrointestinal conditions begin, like inflammatory bowel disease, bowel disease like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, it starts because of the gut lining starts to have gaps between the cells. So colostrum really helps to bind everything together, and it has many benefits beyond gut health. So still related, for example, with gastrointestinal health, it's been shown that it stops H. pylori bacteria to bind to specific fats, for example, which then means that this bacteria isn't able to attach well to stomach lining. And then when it's not able to attach, it's not able to cause the inflammation in the stomach lining, and then that acid reflux can improve, for example. It's also been shown, for example, in the sports industry, that athletes who exercise a lot, they have what is called stress-induced inflammation, and they start forming these gaps in their gut lining because of intense activity. So it's been shown, for example, in an RCT, and there's so many in cyclists and for professional footballers, that taking colostrum for as little as 20 days can heal a severely damaged gut lining to completely healthy conditions.
Wow.
And also, I think what's really impressive for me is that the gut lining itself, it kind of acts like 80% of our immune system, because it's made of kind of immune cells in a way. It's kind of like a primary barrier, what goes from the gut into the bloodstream. So, sorry, now I got my point.
So it goes. Basically, it goes from it's the barrier that prevents things entering into the system, essentially, isn't it?
Exactly. When the kind of toxins or things that should be excreted are entering our bloodstream, it's then carried all around all our organs or body, and that causes inflammation, or contributes at least to inflammation within our entire body, on top of causing local inflammation within the gut. But it also modulates or changes the immune system. So what colostrum can help do is regulate the immune system in a way that is not underactive or overactive. So the research in this field is really new, and we need much more kind of serious, bigger trials to confirm this. But there are some really promising hints that it can be helpful in autoimmune conditions where often the immune system is overactive and attacking itself. So because of this immune regulation, it will help to manage autoimmune conditions.
You explained that colostrum is that early part of milk that babies get access to. What is it that's different about colostrum compared to milk generally?
It's different because it's kind of more supercharged with all sorts of bioactive compounds. So if the colostrum was of good quality, it should contain 400 or more bioactive compounds. So some of these compounds include different immunoglobulins. So for example, the immunoglobulins are these kind of proteins that in simple terms like act like soldiers and fight off harmful bacteria and viruses. So in practical terms, that can, for example, help with recover from like a food poisoning episode or like acute diarrhea. It also contains growth factors. So these help repair and rebuild the gut lining, making it stronger and healthier. But it's also known that some growth hormones that are found within colostrum can contribute to muscle mass and kind of like bone density. That's again from research in sports science. Another type of example of compounds, so they're these antimicrobial peptides, and they're like kind of like natural antibiotics that kill all sorts of harmful pathogens. I mentioned immunoglobulins. So in America, in the last couple of years, colostrum as a supplement really exploded. And what's been really highlighted, one of the kind of like key highlights on every kind of supplement, colostrum supplement pack, is the percentage of these immunoglobulins. So why I'm really proud what we managed to achieve with Gutlings is because worldwide competitors range between 20 and around 35% of immunoglobulins. But we took forever to find suppliers, and I really wanted to beat this. So we managed to find something in the north of France that comes from a grass-fed farm that contains at least 48% of immunoglobulins. So I'm really proud that we're actually surpassing competition in this sector by quite a significant amount.
Okay.
And I'm also really happy that we managed to source it from France, because after living here for a couple of years, I can really see how seriously they take their food standards and all the regulations.
Okay. So this is not a standard American cow. This is a special Northern French cow that's providing this.
Yes, there's no antibiotics. We have all the certificates. Another important factor to mention is that I think people are those with lactose intolerance are interested in whether they'd be able to take it and whether it's suitable. So there is such a tiny proportion of lactose in colostrum compared to milk that it shouldn't affect it. And also you're not drinking a glass of colostrum. It's, as I mentioned, it's a few grams a day. So with lactose intolerance, it's often dose dependent. This meaning that the more you consume, the more severe your symptoms might be. And from consumer feedback, we did this massive report from consumer client comments on competitors regarding different topics, and so we found that no one's really complaining of their lactose symptoms, even if they are not generally consuming lactose.
Right. Okay. So basically, the lactose is less in the colostrum, significantly less than in standard milk. These immunoglobulins, so it's bovine colostrum. Are the immunoglobulins supportive for human health as well as the calves?
Well, yeah, there's so many different kinds of immunoglobulins, like IgG, IgA, IgM. They all have different roles and in immune defense. So I guess a calf again would consume that in much bigger amounts when it's born, and that's its only nutrition, its only food. That's the only thing it consumes. Whereas for humans, it's a small amount. In addition, it's a dietary supplement, so we're not deleting or restricting anything from our diets to kind of benefit from that.
I guess what I mean to say is, do the benefits still apply to human beings if it's a bovine immunoglobulin?
Well, that's a really good question, Kiran. There are randomized controlled trials in humans, done quite a few, that show positive effects of these immunoglobulins having a positive effect on the immune system, iron management of like how the body utilizes tissues to how the body utilizes energy to build tissues instead of break them down, which I mentioned contributes to muscle growth. So it has a widespread effect, and it's been shown in the humans in human trials. So I suppose that they do translate into humans.
Okay, and what about how do they sit? Because obviously this is the primary focus of this is a gut health supplement. So how does that sit in with people who are trying to improve their gut health, their gut microbiome? and are considering about the foods that they're eating. They're thinking about prebiotics. They're thinking about probiotics. Where does colostrum sit within that picture?
So I think it's important to say that no supplement is ever going to substitute anything in the diet. And as a nutritionist, I will never push a supplement without trying to fix someone's diet first. So dietary prebiotics and probiotics for me will always be an absolute priority. Colostrum does contain natural prebiotics, but it's a diet. It's, the word in itself sells as a supplement. That means it's there to supplement and to help you. But the basis for me should always be lifestyle, because it's the most important. I mean, lifestyle is composed of so many different factors. Gut health is not just diet. It's sleep, stress, movement, your relationships with close ones. No supplement is going to make you feel good or happy if you're miserable or burned out. It's
of course, there has to be the foundations. But what if people are taking, say, for example, the classic example would be, okay, someone's taking a probiotic of 4 or 5 different strains of 20 billion bacteria. I know it's more complicated than that, but let's just say this found one from Holland and Barrett, and they are not taking any prebiotics, but they're just taking a probiotic. Why would that person then decide to take a colostrum supplement?
So it might actually complement the probiotics, because the probiotics are the live bacteria and the prebiotics act like food for this live bacteria. And because colostrum contains prebiotics, it would actually help the probiotics survive longer in the gut. But the point of probiotics is not even really surviving in the gut forever. They kind of stay there for a couple of days, and because they feed on the prebiotics, they produce these gut metabolites called postbiotics, which then infer the positive effects on gut health. So I suppose it adds that to the piece of the puzzle to the probiotics.
Okay. And what could people, if people do take colostrum, what in their supplement cabinet do they not need anymore? Is there anything that they can say, okay, actually, well, this is covering that aspect?
Say, like a prebiotic supplement would not be necessary, because I would push more towards getting that from diet. Certain amino acids that are could be promising for gut lining, so like L-glutamine, for example, or even collagen. Bone broth is extremely expensive, so if you're making it at home and it's part of what you do and what you cook anyway, great. But I wouldn't necessarily pay £50 for a pack of bone broth mixed with cacao. I have to say, colostrum is an expensive supplement, but it compensates multiple others that you could take out of your cabinet. And one of the reasons that the main reason why it is expensive is because it's not like milk where it's produced throughout the lifetime of a cow until it's too old. It's only produced when the calf is born. So that's a couple of times in the cow's life, so the supply is super, super limited. And actually, and then we kind of go into the ethical question of it. So if it's super limited, are the calves fed first? And the answer is that yes, a cow makes enough colostrum for twins, but rarely ever has twins. So at least our suppliers, and I know that good other brands, they do this kind of calf first approach, where the colostrum is only taken after the calves are fed first.
Okay. We haven't even thought about the ethical aspects, but that's an important consideration to make, because people might be thinking about that. With the colostrum, you mentioned around it improving gut permeability. Why is that important for people's wider health? Because often I find that the gut microbiome conversation can be just totally focused on gut health without really thinking about how does that tangibly impact people's lives. So let's just go there. If people are improving their gut health with colostrum or with other supplements, how is that actively improving their lives?
Well, gut health the reason our brand is called Gut Links is because gut links to overall health, mental and physical. So it goes way beyond gastrointestinal concerns or just bloating, these kind of smaller concerns, so to say. And it's because of all the links, the gut-brain axis, the gut-skin axis. As mentioned, if there is dysbiosis, if there is, so to say, leaky gut, dysbiosis means an imbalance of good and bad bacteria. Maybe kind of like a very childish explanation, but there's always a fight between the good and the bad guys in the gut environment, like good bacteria and bad bacteria. And when the bad guys take over, they crave the bad stuff, the sugar, the fats, and that's because they feed off it, and that's how they populate. That can impact your cravings. It sounds crazy that these organisms inside you can actually affect your biochemical symptoms and like what your brain wants. So, but again, this happens via the gut-brain axis. It can affect your mood, depressive episodes. As I said, kind of eating behaviors and metabolic health as well, because if there is inflammation, local kind of inflammation within the gut that starts there, it can easily transfer into chronic inflammation throughout the body. That is known to interfere with insulin signaling, and it makes it harder for cells to absorb glucose. So this is kind of a kickstarter for insulin resistance and increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Yeah, these are just some ways. As I mentioned, immunity is really closely related to the gut because 80% of our immunity is in the gut.
I think people often think of metabolic health or metabolic disease, or we'll just focus on type 2 diabetes, for example. They think about the glucose issue, but then it's the underlying reasons, and you've got to keep asking why. So it's not just simply the case that your insulin is resistant. It's like, why is the insulin resistant? Okay, well, maybe perhaps something's going on in the cells. Okay, so the cells have got an excess amount of fat, so they've not got enough receptors. Why have they got an excess amount of fat? Is it perhaps because the body is storing this fat in cells where it shouldn't be, and the mitochondria aren't working properly, so then the pathways within the cell aren't working properly, and then what's contribution to that? And then I think at that stage, people forget that the main entry point into the body is through the gut. And so surely there's something happening between the gut and the rest of the body and metabolic health. Well, of course there is, because glucose is coming in, but it's more than that. And I'm not an expert in gut health, but I am aware of the association between gut health and metabolic disease. And it's as if we try and improve the gut, we're taking a more proactive approach. We're taking a more root cause approach in terms of improving people's health overall. So I think it can be really difficult for people to understand that, can't it? It can be hard to understand how is taking this, or how is improving or supporting my gut health going to improve the rest of my health. And perhaps there's a lot of research out there that needs to be looked into that's already been done. I think sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The research is already there. But having the more tools available, perhaps this is one supplement that would support people. Like you mentioned, though, that this isn't very big in Europe. This is an area of supplementation and health that seems to be better known in America. Why is that the case?
Well, I think because Australia and America are trendsetters in the health industry in general. Whatever goes on there comes to Europe a few years later, and that's exactly what's happening, because this year we've seen a few local UK brands developing big brands like big protein brands like Bulk, creating a colostrum supplement. And we've seen American players entering the UK market. So I think it's coming, and I think it's going to be quite big, to be honest.
Okay. Well, I would suggest that because American healthcare is so vastly, so crazily expensive compared to European healthcare, I know each country is different, that perhaps they're trying to find more and more solutions to avoid the costs that pile on at the end. But I think there's fast growing markets and there's a big demand there. And I think that demand is growing across the globe. So it is interesting that it's coming over this way. You mentioned around Helicobacter pylori. So that's this bacteria that many people know about, increases acid reflux symptoms, increases acid in the stomach, not easily treated, but can be treated with antibiotics. And just for viewers' knowledge, this is quite common in the population. I can't remember the percentages off the top of my head, but it's pretty common. And it can increase the long-term risk of developing stomach cancer, which is why medically, when we're thinking about it in general practice or in medical fields, we're thinking about getting rid of it so we can reduce the risk of you developing stomach cancer in the future. So how does colostrum help with Helicobacter pylori? So
one of the ways in which it helps is due to these antimicrobial peptides, which I mentioned, that work like natural antibiotics. So it helps to kill the harmful bacteria, which H. pylori is a harmful one. And also there is a compound called lactoferrin, which is like an iron-binding protein that helps to boost immunity and fight microbes. So again, a microbe can be considered as a H. pylori. And there was a study where lactoferrin in colostrum specifically, so it helped. So there were two groups: standard treatment alone. So this is your typical medication like omeprazole and colostrum, specifically like lactoferrin within colostrum. and it was shown that lactoferrin was 92% significantly effective versus medication was 68% effective. So I think it's quite a big, it's over 20% kind of improvement. This kind of research as well, it needs bigger trials, and there's loads of emerging small studies that need to be replicated. But I think all these hints are quite promising in this field.
So is that so in terms of effect, how is effective measured? Is it like sort of symptoms or curing? How was that measured?
So as mentioned, the colostrum stops H. pylori attaching to specific fats. And these specific fats, without these specific fats, the H. pylori cannot attach very effectively to the gut lining, not to the gut, to the stomach lining. So when it cannot attach, it's not able to cause all this inflammation, which then causes acid reflux. That's the main mechanism.
So this is really interesting. It's something I'm probably going to have to look at. So the H. pylori might still be there, but the negative impacts of H. pylori isn't being created. So it's not that we're necessarily getting rid of it. It's that it's not as harmful potentially as before.
Two ways, not as harmful, but also the antimicrobial peptides, they help to kill it.
Okay, yes.
So also get rid of it.
Well, that's interesting. Looks like there's a lot of scope for colostrum.
Sorry?
There's a lot of scope for colostrum here.
I think so. I think it can open up so many conversations. What's really interesting for me is that I wasn't aware of it whatsoever before I stumbled upon research. And I think many health professionals are not yet either. And I think it's just such a new, interesting thing. As I said, it opens the doors to so many other areas of health outside of gastrointestinal health. Oh. So I think, there's loads to talk about when it comes to it.
Is there anything else that we haven't heard from you about colostrum that we need to know right now?
I think you've heard it all right now.
we've heard a lot about colostrum. Okay, so just to tie things off, we've covered quite a bit here. In terms of the colostrum, if people want to explore gut link supplements, how can they find out more about the support that you're providing from colostrum?
So our Instagram handle is We Are Gut Links. We will be launching pre-orders very soon, or perhaps maybe when this is released, it's already launched. Yeah, we as a startup, we're self-funding, so we actually ordered quite a limited amount of packs to start with. So I'm not saying this to sound salesy that you should order your pack, but I'm generally saying that it might be gone if you don't pre-order by the time the actual thing comes in, because we don't have a lot.
Okay. So by the time you're watching this, they're probably sold out. But if you haven't, go check it out at We Are Gut Links.
We Are Gut Links, yes.
Okay, great. So We Are Gut Links. So it's been a bit of a journey today in terms of discussing so many different aspects. So we talked a little bit about your journey in terms of your experiences in childhood, very early childhood, all the way to teenage years, and then coming into sort of how you helped to improve your own health, as well as learning around health coaching, personal training, and nutrition, and also CBT. So wide range of skills. Then, of course, you support patients with their relationships with eating. You support patients with MAHI as well for diabetes and metabolic health. But then, interestingly, you've now got into real closer, in-depth knowledge onto one type of food or supplement called colostrum. And you're just releasing a supplement around that. And there's a ton of science around there. So I think that's testament that there is, the more you go into this, the more unknowns there are, the more there is to learn. There's more potential impacts for your health. And if I was to sort of provide a summary for this is not about your appearance. This is about your health. And this is about treating the root cause, and even in many cases, preventing the development of illness and supporting your health rather than looking at your appearance.
Yeah, you actually touched on these three areas very well, because three areas meaning food, relationship, gut health, and metabolic health for type 2 diabetes specifically, because I always say that my main goal is to help women ditch the guilt and love food again. But then I always take a very deep look at their blood sugar levels and their insulin levels and so on, as well as their gut health, because I really believe that these two act like gateways that open the door to so many other aspects of health.
Thank you so much. Any other final comments?
No final comments. I think I really enjoyed this conversation with you, Kiran. And if anyone else would like to find me on socials or ask me a question or just learn more about my work, they can find me at honestly_nutrition.
Thank you, Gabby. It's been a really great conversation.
Thanks, Kiran.
Okay, bye. Bye.